North Korea's Kim Jongun has traveled outside of his country for the first time since inheriting power in 2011. He made the trip by train to China, where he met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The two leaders likely discussed economic sanctions against the Kim regime and upcoming talks with President Trump. Well, joining us with some insights is Dr. Carl Minzner. He's an expert in Chinese law and governance and professor of law at Fordham University. He's also the author of a new book called End of an Era: How China's Authoritarian Revival is Undermining Its Rise. Xi Jinping met with Yoon. He was one of the most Googled names recently, Xi was. So what's he up to?
Well, certainly, I think Kim is certainly interested in making sure that his relations with China are solid in advance of the upcoming potential meeting with Trump. So I think that's what's on Kim's mind. For Xi, he's also very interested in trying to understand what's going on with Kim, worried about instability on his northeast frontier.
Yeah, he seems like he's very concerned about that. I think he said at one time, you're causing instability here for China and the whole region. So what do you think they were discussing?
Well, I certainly think Xi wants to know what Kim is planning to do with respect to nuclear proliferation issues. And as you highlighted, I think one of Xi's top concerns is implications on his border that might impact domestic stability inside China itself, which is Xi Jinping's top priority.
Trump administration is in talks with China about tighter tariffs on products imported into the U.S. by that country. And some say we could be heading for a trade war that may prove devastating to the global economy. What do you think?
Well, I certainly think Trump is pivoting away from decades of U.S. commitment towards multilateral organizations and free trade policies. And the tariffs that were announced relatively suddenly do seem to be a decision primarily of his own making. And so it's introduced a significant element of uncertainty going forward in U.S.-China relations. Chinese have already announced some prospective counter tariffs, and they've held out the possibility that they might have more aggressive measures, such as on soybeans, if this should blow up into a full-scale battle between the two countries over trade.
Yes, it always seems like they respond to these things with sanctions or basically tariffs, I guess, against American agricultural products. Now, China recently also held military drills in the South China Sea, and President Xi reportedly vowed to wage a bloody battle for world domination. So what do you think that was all about?
Well, some of that is just rhetoric, but the Chinese authorities have been sending signals, particularly to neighbors in the Southeast Asia, that they're very tight on their territorial claims in the South China Sea. So some of those moves are directed at Vietnam, at Philippines, and neighboring countries to tell them back off. We're serious about maintaining our territorial claims.
Well, how should the U.S. respond? Should we just ignore that?
The United States has responded with these freedom of navigation operations around some of the Chinese islands, claimed islands, and sort of created islands that have been created from the ocean, to demonstrate that the United States adheres to principles of freedom of navigation. And in fact, I believe the French also have now, and perhaps all of the Australians as well, have also stepped in to say this is also a principle that we have an interest in upholding as well.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with that at a time when we're relying on China to help negotiate the deal with North Korea. They've got a lot of problems of their own, have they not?
They do have many deep problems economically and politically. China's domestic politics are entering a crucial era. I mean, you are now seeing the end of China's reform era. What we thought were Chinese politics from starting in 1978, this period that we think of the reform era, was marked by rapid economic growth, a certain degree of ideological openness to the outside, and relative political stability. China, which was a one-man state under Mao, essentially has now, in the 80s and 90s, became a one-party state, really where collective leadership was the norm. And what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks is that's eroding. You're now seeing China begin to swing back towards a more personalized authoritarian regime that, in my view, is a lot less stable.
And what do you think that means for the future then, inside China?
I worry that those risks of instability that you might start to see as those political norms that had built up in the 80s and 90s begin to erode. Some of the instability that existed in the 1960s and 70s comes back, where leadership decisions begin to reflect the will of an individual, where purges of people who fall on the wrong side of the top leader perhaps become more common. And so I really worry about what this means. I think in the short term, it's a more hardline authoritarian regime. In the longer term, I think it's potentially a more unstable one.
So maybe another cultural revolution?
Not in the short term, but you're starting to think along the lines that I'm worried about, and that has real implications for domestic politics in China.
And I think for our viewers, it would mean real implications for the Christian population there.
Absolutely.
As we've seen crackdowns and so forth.
I think state controls on religion are likely to be ramped up. I think you are entering an era. The 1970s and 80s saw the party back a little bit out of this realm of trying to govern people's personal lives. Religious belief, you had more flexibility to do what you wanted in private as long as you didn't try to organize publicly. And one of the things that's happening right now is Chinese leaders are really starting to take a much tighter look at religions, particularly the ones they regard as foreign. There's this very intense interest in Islam and some really draconian controls that have descended across Western China. And I think it's an open question as to whether some of those controls start to move into and or begin to be used against the Christian community as well. You've seen some suggestion of that in one particular eastern province, and it's probably a good idea to watch out to see whether that starts to spread more widely in China.